Player-centered approach, reality-based training. Good morning, coaches. Today is the second in a series of 4 short videos explaining the player-centered approach. In the first video, underlying autonomy, explaining autonomy, I talked about how decision-making can open the door for players' attention so that they can combine their attention and intention for navigating game situations. Today, with reality-based training, talking about how we want our practice sessions and our activities to mirror the game. The first thing we want to think about in a reality-based training is that in-game situation. When we look at the match and we look at the entire game, how can that inform us about what we want to then transfer into our practice? Because ultimately we want activities and the behaviors and the characteristics in our activities to transfer to the game. And so when we think about that in-game situation, that should be the first step in informing us what we want to see. So in the game, what specific situations are we looking at? Are we looking at how our attacking players are navigating the problems that they face in the attacking half? Are we looking at the game moment? Are we looking at attack? Are we looking at transition to defend? Are we looking at defend? Or are we looking at transition to attack? And so if we're thinking about that idea of, hey, we're looking at our wide players in possession, we're looking at that attacking moment. And so we want to think about in the attacking half, how can that inform us? What specific situation is involved? If we're looking at the 7, but we're also looking at the 2 and how we can create those overloads, we want to be specific about that. We're looking at the 7 in attack, in the attacking half, in that wide area. And so when we think about in the game, that's what we see. How can our practice activities and our session activities reflect and represent that reality-based moment? And so when we contextualize it, we want to make sure we're creating as much reflection and reality of that situation as possible. Are we looking at that specific area of the field? How can we recreate that? Are we looking at the 2 and the 7 with the opposition that they are facing? Are they facing a back line of 4 or 5 or 3? What specific situation is going to instruct and how can we recreate that? Once we have dialed in on that specific in-game situation, we want to think about what principles, sub-principles, and player actions can we build into our coaching points. If we're looking at when the 7 receives the ball from the midfielder, they're facing forward towards the goal, and we're thinking about, okay, specific player actions built on those sub-principles and principles. What principle is going to best inform us? Are we looking at breaking lines, or are we looking at finishing the attack? How can we help our players attune to those situations based on the principle, not on a rule? We want to make sure we have underneath that idea of could, not should. We don't want our players to be robotic. Every time you get the ball, drive to the end line. That is a rule that can be useful in certain situations, but rather if we are building our coaching points around principles and sub-principles, we're thinking about how can we create an overload? How can we get a 2v1 scenario for our 7? Who is best going to be available to do that? Hey, 2, what would happen if you overlapped? Could you provide an overload for your 7 by overlapping? Or would it be better to provide an overload by underlapping? Rather than going around but going through is going to provide a different way to solve that problem. And giving our players options in our coaching points, what can we do to create an overload? We know we want to make it dangerous for the opponent, create unpredictability, and having an overload is going to accentuate that. Rather than say should, think about could. And so when we think about reality-based training, first and foremost, we want to make sure that we're thinking about that in-game situation. Who specifically is involved? What area of the field is involved? And then moving towards our principles, what specific game moment? What are our objectives, our principles, sub-principles, and specific player actions? And how can that inform us to better facilitate our coaching points to help our players attune to the environment and deal with the reality of the game in practice situations? Player-centered approach, reality-based training. Cheers.